suppose let's begin. So I'm Joe. I think I've got an opportunity to meet all of you before. So this is great. We got a nice small group so we can interact a whole bunch. So we're going to be talking today about LO strategies, and I don't think there's, so I think we can adjust, especially because we have so few folks, what we want to do specifically, but I had in mind a couple of things. The first is that we're going to focus mostly on, how to conceptually select a strategy and, what is strategic to read in the LO. I think I'm probably going to plan on spending not a whole bunch of time on this is how you write a disad, this is how you write a critique, this is what those arguments look like. I think that there's kind of other content at the workshop that should be taking care of that. Does that sound kind of okay to everyone? Mm-hmm. Okay, great. And then towards the end, I'm also going to talk about a few things that are not as strategy-based about the LO. There shouldn't be too much of that because the LO is mostly about selecting strategies, but this is, I think, kind of the only LO speech. So it said strategies on schedule, so we're mostly focused on that, but we're also going to cover some general LO stuff. So, what do we mean by an LOC strategy? So the strategy means more or less the collection of arguments that we're reading in the LOC. Obviously, the LOC is the first negative speech. You're setting up your strategy for the block. By the way, feel free to take many diligent notes. I'm also just going to put this whole thing on the Dropbox later, so you shouldn't, absorb and learn and listen to the magical power of my explanation, and don't feel tempted to write every single thing down. But also write everything down if you feel like it. What do I care? So, but it's the collection of arguments that we're reading in the LOC, and it sets up the negatives options. So many possible disads. You could read a critique and a disadvantage and topicality, or you could read the politics disad and case and a topic disad, or you could read just one-off critique, just a very long critique. You could do nothing but answer the affirmative's case. Any number of things. So. The importance of picking that strategy correctly in the LOC, the first thing is that you really only get one shot at that. The neg gets to talk basically 2 times. I know there's 3 neg speeches, but they basically come at 2 times. And it's this speech which lays out the strategy, the LOC, and then it's the block speeches function together to make that strategy work against what the affirmative is doing. So you have kind of one shot to set up your offense, to set up the positions you want to be going for in the round. It also goes a long way in determining the options for and the difficulty of both of the member speeches. So, as an MG, if there are any MGs in the room, some MGs are much harder than the others, and that is sometimes it's a function of delivery, sometimes it's a function of a topic being weird, or I don't know, your case ended up being bad for some reason, but it's mostly a function of negative strategy. And for the MO, I don't know, the LO is kind of a forgotten speech. Perhaps that's why we didn't have as many homies show up. But the MO is the speech that is going to win or lose most rounds for the negative team. But the LO is super important in terms of deciding kind of how possible it's going to be for the MO to do their job. So, what makes a good LOC strategy? I'd like to hear from you all about what you think might be good in an LOC, desirable.
Having a cohesive strategy that doesn't put you in a position where your arguments are contradicting themselves.
Perhaps.
Where you're stuck going for arguments that contradict themselves.
Yeah. You don't want to be stuck. You don't want a strategy that kind of forces you into a position that conflicts with itself, or a strategy where you have some arguments that make other arguments of yours very difficult to win. Often.
You probably want to have like a few options to go for, so the ML has choices and what to focus on for the round.
Yeah, very good.
All of your arguments have potential for offense that you can get in another round.
All of your arguments are offensive? Is that what you said?
Most of them, yeah.
Most of them?
A couple different offensive arguments that you have a chance to get anything out of.
Yeah, I mean, offense is definitely super important. Some other thoughts, things that make particularly good strategies? Alright, I think there's some good thoughts there. I'd like to talk about, and I don't think you all mentioned some of the things that I'd like to talk about that there being problems with, but I'm going to do those anyway. So there are some very common approaches that I think people have to what makes a good strategy that are, kind of problematic. I think people really are into the idea of X combination of arguments. Like, what's great is topicality, disad, critique. What's really effective is when you just go for only case. This is problematic because there's no context, right? It doesn't factor in your judge, the opponent, the AF, the resolution, the quality of those arguments, the way that those arguments interact with one another. I think strategy really is all about context. A lot of people also talk about having good disads or being well researched, but it kind of begs the question of what makes a disad good anyway. It also makes you reliant on specific arguments, right? And I think the diversity is super important. More importantly, it conflates argument quality with strategic quality. You can read a disad that's very well researched, and even in many ways a good disad, and have it be part of a bad strategy. Maybe it's a bad strategy because the affirmative is not giving you a link to it. Maybe it's a bad strategy because the affirmative is going to be very good at answering it. Maybe it's a bad strategy because what you really needed to do was read something else. But the quality of the argument is not really determined by the strategy. The strategy is, kind of determined in other ways. So, because also I think the argument is people really talk about the LOC catching people off guard. Again, there's no context. It can often be very advantageous to kind of catch people off guard, but the idea of catching people off guard is what does that trade off with, because a lot of times what you read that catches people off guard catches them off guard because it's very counterintuitive, because the arguments are not very good. Or in the round you're in, what is the importance of catching people off guard? If you're a top 10 team in the country and you're debating against someone who's less experienced, catching them off guard has very little value for you, because you should be just trying to do your thing and do it well. So in my opinion, what makes a good LOC is really comes down to one central question, or one central idea is you set up the block to have more offense than the affirmative. It's all about leveraging comparatively more offense than the affirmative it has, or setting yourself up to have more of that. So let's talk briefly about offense and defense. Who can tell me what offense and defense are? Because it's just super important, such a core concept in debate.
Defense is a response to their case that says, like, this is why the arguments they're making aren't reasons to vote for them, and offense is responses to, like, offense is either your own case or responses to their case that say this is why you're voting for us.
Yeah, I think that that's you clearly understand the concept. I'd quibble with your wording a little bit, because it's the idea of don't vote for them but vote for us. Those are the same thing, right? Because the judge can only vote
This is
for
why those
one of
points
the two.
don't go on their scoreboard. This is why
Yeah, exactly.
go on ours.
And in terms of points on the scoreboard is, I think, a very good way to think about it. The way that that I would tell you to remember it, although you clearly have the concept down anyway, so it doesn't matter, is that offense is securing impacts for you, defense is denying impacts to them. I think that the more you can phrase everything you do in debate in terms of the impacts that it gets or the impacts that it denies, the better your understanding of debate will be. Although clearly you're not having any trouble with offense defense, which is great. So this does not mean. And I'll quibble a little bit with, and what was your name, sir?
Kenneth.
Kenneth? Okay, cool. It wasn't Logan. I knew that Logan was some other person, and I didn't call you that. Good job.
Glad we got that sorted out.
Yeah, what's that? Great. Cool. So I'll quibble a little bit with Kenneth's idea of most of your arguments being offense. That might, in many instances, be true, but I don't know. That seems like in many cases that doesn't necessarily have to be true. Let's take the example of a very small pick strategy. Let's say you found just this awesome plan-inclusive counterplan. It's like, we're going to do all of AF except for this one thing. If you read that strategy, the counterplan is a defensive argument, right? All of your arguments on case for why the thing that you're picking out of is an important or defensive argument. And then your offense is all just this little thing of like, hey, there's a tiny reason that we should. There's a tiny reason why one of the things you do is bad, and that is sufficient, right? So I think contextually, it doesn't always need to be all offense, and I think defense can play an equal role. The question is comparative offense, and if your defense is very effective at limiting the affirmative, that is a way of generating comparative offense, right? Like, if you make the affirmative smaller, that is a way of making the offensive impacts you're reading on the negative bigger in comparison. So you can, in a way, generate offense by reading defense. I think that You want to always be thinking in terms of how do you have more offense than them, but that doesn't mean just reading offensive arguments. What else doesn't that mean? And I think seems like we have a crew that grasps this concept pretty well, but it doesn't mean having more offense than them doesn't always mean having bigger stuff, right? It doesn't always mean I'm going to have this giant disad because that's a ton of offense. Not necessarily true. If you have a counter plan, then you don't need your disad to be bigger. Or if you are able to, or if you're able to solve the impacts of case with your K, you don't need your impacts to be huge. Or if you're able to, just read enough case defense, it doesn't need to be huge. Generally, having some very big impacts is useful to you, but not always necessary. It also doesn't mean that reading as many off-case positions as possible. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but there's lots of different ways to be flexible, to generate a lot of offense without just reading a bunch of different off-case positions, right? Like 3 disads does not necessarily generate more offense for you in comparison to the AF than 1 disad in a bunch of case answers. What it does mean, I think there are a few things that we're thinking about that I'm going to be talking about a little bit more. Is flexible options for offense, which is something that we mentioned when we were talking about good LSCs, so very well done. Flexible options for offense, meaning that you can kind of go for a different combination of things. That's incredibly useful. Having multiple ways to deal with the offense of the affirmative. So saying, I'm either going to be able to go for this counter plan, or I'm going to be able to outweigh, or I'm going to be able to go for my case arguments. Again, having different things for the MO to do. Because when you have different things for the MO to do, that means the MG is going to have to be able to cover each of those things. Gives your MO a lot of different options to exploit. Also, being efficient with LO arguments. Don't waste time, don't waste arguments, don't waste words. And making the LO difficult to answer. So we're going to talk about these point by point. Flexible options for offense. So yeah, like I said, this doesn't mean you're reading 5 off. It means having a number of different ways you can go for offense. And I think that a key concept in being able to set yourself up to have a flexible strategy is having internal collapsibility. So let's say you have a politics argument. It's just 1 disad, but it can be very flexible. You have a link about a focus trade-off, you've got your link about moderate Democrats, and a link about Republicans. So what that sounds like is plan trades off with this bill, which means people aren't focusing on it, so they're not going to push it through. Also, plan pisses off moderate Democrats, so they're not going to want to be part of the coalition anymore. Also, it pisses off, a few Republicans, so they're just going to want to be obstructionists, and they're going to filibuster it or something, right? You can't answer those arguments all require different answers, right? And if you think about the way that people answer the link arguments of politics, it's often something like, link turn, it's popular, link turn, Republicans love it. Well, that doesn't answer the moderate Democrats claim, and it doesn't answer this focus trade-off claim. Focus trade-off claim doesn't even talk about popularity. It's a question of the amount of attention that people are paying to various things. So, makes your stuff a lot harder to answer. An example of limited flexibility is if you have an econ dissent that says, and you're going to collapse the economy because you're bad. You also have debt ceiling politics or some politics with an econ impact, which is also you're going to stop us passing this bill, which collapses the economy. Why does that limit your flexibility? Go ahead and shout out an answer is fine.
Just has 1 link.
Well, it doesn't have 1 link. They'd have different links. They're 2 different disads.
They're going for the same impact.
And what does that, allow the MG to do, or how does it limit your flexibility?
Then that takes out both of your pieces of offense.
Yes, or if they just read,
outweigh it, or if they don't prioritize it, those impacts.
Or if they just read impact defense too. But yeah, it allows them to answer both positions with a single argument. Not good level of flexibility. Flexible options force the MG to answer a high number of unique arguments. The job becomes much tougher. Well, I'm reading topicality and this disad with 3 different link scenarios and this critique. Well, I'm going to have my framework answers, I'm going to have a permutation on the critique, I'm going to have to answer critique impacts, and I'm going to need offense against the critique. I'm also going to have counter-interpretation with a bunch of counter standards on T and some voting answers T. And I'm going to have to answer this disad. I'm going to probably need uniqueness arguments, impact defense, and link arguments. But I'm going to have impact and link defense to each of the different scenarios. That's, and if you're good in the MO, and your MO is good, think about all those things. It's like any one of those things doesn't get done, the MO has pretty easy ability to capitalize on those things. So I said on the other page, almost always in terms of flexible options for offense. I would encourage you all to, until you start feeling really comfortable, until you start feeling, like you're just masters of strategy, to always give yourself flexibility. I think there are probably times that you won't need flexibility. I think sometimes, you'll make a decision that, hey, we've been saving this argument for this specific team, and we know that it's going to surprise them and they're not going to see it coming. And a lot of times this will be, later in your career when people are expecting certain arguments from you, because you've had a pattern in what you've been running before. At that point, I think you can just say, no, we're going to be really good at this option, and we're just going to dare them to beat us at it, because this is the best option for us. That's a very contextual call, but sometimes that's the right call. So let's talk about multiple ways to deal with the affirmative. It's a very similar concept to what we just talked about. It allows the MO to go for the offense the MG does the worst job on, which makes it easier for them to win that offense. It's the same concept that we were talking about before. It gives the MO a bunch of different options that they're able to use, but the difference is that it's not just about providing yourself different offense, it's providing yourself ways to deal with their offense, which keep your different offensive options alive. So, like a less flexible LOC can force the MO to go for bad arguments in order to catch up with the app. So let's say, and this is something I see all the time, the LOC is, you got a conditional actor counterplan, right? China does the plan, we got a politics disad, and then we've got our China relations disadvantage. Seems like a flexible strategy, seems like probably a pretty good strategy. But if you don't answer case, what the MG does is can read China internal politics, or say if China does the plan, that pisses off Japan, or if China doesn't do the plan, or if China does the plan, it ruins the Chinese economy, right? These are all some arguments you can see someone making on this. That becomes devastating because it puts the MO in a very tough position. So let's say I've got this, I have an answer case, I've got my counter plan, and I've got these disadvantages, but they're independent disadvantages to the counter plan. I have two options. I can either kick the counter plan, in which case I don't have answers to case, and I just have to rely on my disad being so good that it outweighs case, in probability, magnitude, or some combination of the two. Now think about why that's hard. They answered your disads, obviously, in the MG, right? And it's the first time you've answered case. It's going to be very hard for you to be ahead of that debate. Now, your other option is to go for a counterplan, but the MG has a disadvantage to the counterplan, which means that you have to not only go for your disad, which is usually hard to do, right? That takes a lot of block. You have to compare the disad to this MG disad, but you have to answer all of that disad. And you have to answer it so well that the PMR won't be able to go for it. And think about the strategic problem, or the structural problem that there is there. They read one set of answers, you get one shot to answer it, and they get monopoly on the second line, right? That puts you in a very bad position. It's like a world in which, it's a world in which like the MO gets to go for a disad, but the PMR doesn't get to talk again, right? They're going to win it almost every single time. The MO is almost always ahead on the disad after the block. So you need to think carefully about what the MG might do to limit your options and ensure that you're going to have some scenario to deal with case. If you want to read something conditionally, give yourself the actual option to kick it. I think that's a mistake I see all the time amongst intermediate debaters who are starting to play around with multiple conditional strategies or even single conditional indices. Did you have a question, Kenneth?
No, just searching.
Gotcha. I think it's especially important, with conditional strategies. Similarly, if you need a disad to turn case to win, like let's say, you've got like this one small disad, you've got some different case turns, and you've got one big disad that super directly interacts with case and turns it. If the only way that you're able to beat that case is by turning case with this disad, congratulations, you're now going for that disad. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is a limited strategy because you only really have this singular option. That takes away all the flexibility and all the reasons we talked about that flexibility being good. Another big thing to focus on in the LOC is maximizing efficiency. There's a couple different ways that this works, and the first is to just do not read arguments you won't go for. I think that's like one of the silliest mistakes that I see people make. People make it all the time, but if you're just like not really going for this argument, it's probably a bad idea to read the argument. There's a bunch of different ways that people do this. The biggest, silliest thing that people do though is they read like the quote-unquote throwaway topicality, right? And they're like, well, it's good time suck is the thing they always say. It's like, it's a good time suck. It's a bad strategy for a few reasons, or in my opinion, right? Like, go ask your coaches; they're often smarter than me. But I think it's a pretty bad strategy because often it's really transparent, right? Especially with topicality, but even sometimes with like super weird Ks. You know, depending on the panel, people will know, hey, they're not going for this argument in front of this judge. But it's often transparent, which means people are going to read kind of like a bare minimum set of answers against it, and you won't get your time trade-off. But the other thing is that time trade-off's not really helpful to you if it stops you from developing a better option, right? So perhaps you get to read T, and you read T in 50 seconds, and the MG spends a minute 20, a minute 30 on T. Sounds like a good time trade-off, but it's not exactly really how time trade-offs work, right? Because the time trade-off's only helpful if it gets you like a big favorable advantage on something you actually want to go for. So let's say your strategy is, a common one, at least it used to be more common than it is, but fairly common strategy is topicality, critique, and case arguments. So you read those arguments, they spend a little bit too much time on T, but the T argument's not good, you never plan on going for it. Then it just turns out that like you're reading, I don't know, cap against some MG that just loves getting down on the cap debate. And the impact turns are savage, and all of a sudden you're in a huge world of trouble. Like, this T's not really an option, because it turns out it was, kind of a crappy argument the whole time that you didn't plan on going for. And like, yeah, you got 40 seconds against the MG on the critique, but how much is that really valuable to you if they're good enough that you don't want to go for the critique anyway, right? You would have been a lot better off, like, shortening up your critique a little bit and reading a 2-minute disad, and then allow yourself to, go for the disad. Even if they overcover the disad, perhaps they don't cover it as well as they cover the critique. I don't know. Does that concept make sense? Like, it's bad to read arguments, you're not going to go for. That time trade-off is not effective because it doesn't actually, produce, the best time trade-off is the time trade-off you get by actually having a different option. I also think it's really important to not have wasted arguments within positions. Ask yourself as you're reading a disad in prep or in your back files and stuff, what it does for you that couldn't be done. What it does for you strategically, what it proves about your position that you wouldn't be able to prove otherwise. It's really good to know 4 reasons why a single link argument is true. You don't need all of those arguments to be in the shell. Another benefit of LOC strategies is they're difficult to answer. And this is kind of so obviously true that it's hard to kind of talk about too much, but always be thinking about, and this is the strategy that you need to be thinking about when you're coming up with your LOC strategy. You need to be thinking about what are they going to say, and how are we going to beat that, or how are we going to make it difficult for them to answer this in the way they want. Kind of a few ways you can do that. I think one really good plan is to trap the other team. And sometimes these traps are super tricky, and sometimes they're kind of obvious. They're kind of clearly traps, but they're still hard to get around. So, a strategy we had in our files for NPTE last year was against a warming advantage. You read a China counterclaim, which just says China implements a carbon tax. Then on case, you read a set of arguments saying the affirmative is not able to solve back for China because it's too expensive for China to stop polluting. Why are these arguments effective together? What does the MG have to do that's hard? Someone just take a shot at it. No wrong answers. Can't. Well, there's wrong answers, but it's just okay.
They either have to show how the counterplan doesn't solve for the case, or why, or come up with answers as to how the app does solve for China.
I think mostly good. Does anyone want to modify that or elaborate a little bit? You're about there. It's not either, it's both. That's what's tricky. They have to do both of those things. They have to say, listen, no, China couldn't do it themselves, but if America does it, that will lead to China reducing emissions, right? Because if they agree that China can do it themselves, then the counterplan's able to solve the case, and any risk of politics or any risk of a US specific disad is sufficient for you to win the rank. if they agree that it's impossible for you to solve China, then they lose the global warming advantage. Maybe they get to go for advantage 2. I think probably that's what would happen in this debate a lot of times, is they would go for their second advantage. But they lose kind of one of their biggest impacts, and they'd have to compare that to the politics disad, or perhaps your reading critique or whatever else, right? But it forces them to do both of those things. And it's pretty hard to envision a world in which it's true that China can't solve global warming by itself, but if we start solving global warming, then China will do it. It's a very difficult argument to make. I think probably, for the record, not that this is particularly important or related to LO Strategies, what I would do in that instance is I would read a dissent to the counterplan, which says something like Chinese internal politics would become messed up, and perhaps the hardline factions would be pretty pissed off if the PLA unilaterally started implementing a carbon tax without the United States acting. I think that's probably true, but it's kind of hard to write a Chinese internal politics dissad in the MG when you're busy dealing with a bunch of other stuff. So another thing that's super important that makes you harder and harder to answer is you should not, and this is something everyone does, and as you become a coach, or if you ever become a coach, don't, go get a real job. But if you ever become a coach, this shit will drive you crazy. Everyone just reads the same arguments, and they read them the same way every time, and they lose to the same arguments. You should be keeping track of what people do that's difficult to answer, right? Like I remember, who remembers, y'all are familiar with and sort of remember the different debt ceiling crises that have happened, right? So it was a huge deal, I think probably 2011 was when it was the worst, like during the spring, and then that was the summer the downgrade happened, and it got really bad. So that was everyone's politics dissad, was debt ceiling. Because there were the fights were going. Everyone's like, there's going to be a compromise, but you disturb the compromise. And
even last year was like
that. Yeah, last year in the fall, it was definitely a thing too. And the same thing sort of happened last year in the fall. I just remember particularly people losing to the same arguments. So this is not a war story. This is meant to be instruction, because I'm not going to talk about some round where we did something great. But it's a trend that happened. Everyone was reading this argument, and everyone's answer to this debt ceiling thing is the Republicans will never allow us to hit the debt ceiling. That's crazy. They know it would crash the economy. The Republicans will never do it. And people would just lose to it, and lose to it, and lose to it, just over and over and over again. Obviously what you need to do is you need to sit down and change your argument, or just write answers to this argument. So you could have a bunch of different ways to answer that argument. You could say, it's a miscalculation, the Republicans are going to try to get extractions from the Democrats, right? But then the Democrats won't meet, and then all of a sudden we'll go over the debt ceiling while those fights are happening, and you cause those fights. Or you'll piss off a single rogue Republican who will filibuster the debt ceiling, and that'll be enough for us to go over. Or, or it's ideological for Republicans, so they'll do it no matter what. Or the Republicans think our economy is going to crash if they don't stop the debt ceiling because they're worried about debt. Or the Republicans don't actually think this would destroy the economy, and this is actually kind of a war story, I'll admit it. But I found a letter, an op-ed that was written by a Republican senator that said this wouldn't crash the economy, right? But instead, people just go in there with the same damn argument and lose to the same thing every time. So change your stuff up. You should pay attention to how other teams are losing to arguments. I don't know. A good goal for you, and it's not a possible goal because some people will be faster than you, or judges make mistakes or whatever, but you should always have the goal of not losing to the same argument twice, right? And always fixing the mistakes you've made in the past as a debater, and repairing those mistakes. Let's see what else. The other thing is that in this, the example I gave for this one, I ended up using for the last one, so I'll have a different example. But your LOC should also just have arguments included in it that answer the most obvious answers to it, right? If you're going to have an argument about China and the United States going to war over East Asian islands, you need a reason why mutually assured destruction fails to check the conflict, right? Build that in. Your LOC should always be doing that. And a little bit, this is a little bit more argument construction than strategy construction, but I don't know. I think it works in similar ways. You can think about how these things would strategically work on the strategic level and not just the argument level as well. So let's talk a little bit about the process of picking a strategy. I don't know exactly how this works in your prep rooms, whether your coaches are like, everybody listen up, we're prepping this, or maybe you go off with your partner and you just pick something. This, honestly, I don't think is something that can be, taught as much without the other stuff. I think how you actually decide what arguments you're reading is really just more a question of understanding what makes a strategic argument. But we can talk a little bit about the process of what picking a strategy looks like on an individual resolution. So I think, so let's say the resolution comes out. Let's think of an example resolution. What was the resolution this morning?
U.S. federal government should ensure food security, or something like that.
I don't want that. Sorry. Thank you though. So let's say it's, I don't know, let's say it's the United States federal government should significantly decrease its military aid to Israel. And let's pretend it's not the res we had for this camp where it talks about the blockade, just it should decrease its aid to Israel. What offense are you going to get links to? You should think about what generics you get links to, what things might the resolution kind of cause, and who are the people who are affected by the resolution. So, decrease military aid to Israel. What are some offensive arguments we get links to? Just any offensive argument's fine.
Israel freak out.
Israel freaks out, sure. Other countries could freak out too. Saudi Arabia, perhaps other Middle Eastern allies. What other stuff? Critiques.
It would lead to a loss of influence over Israel.
Yeah,
Especially
Israel,
if they become
yeah.
self-sufficient.
Yeah, we won't be able to control the Middle East peace process, perhaps, because we lose our relations with Israel, which is perhaps is a different scenario than freak out. I can see how those are two different positions.
Jewish lobby tags?
Yeah, just general politics. I think that probably there's a bunch of political ramifications that aren't directly related to AIPAC, but yeah, that too. What else? There's a bunch. Let's get at least one critique that we get links to.
Realism?
Sure, any critique of realism, certainly. Things about threat construction.
Cap, biopower probably.
Cap, sort of. I don't know, it links to cap insofar as everything links to cap.
Yeah.
Biopower, there's certainly some like Agamben type arguments, right? So I don't know, so this comes out and you start thinking about, alright, we got all the shit we can read. Then I think probably the next step is to think about what offense will the AF read in the PMC. So that's again, think about generic advantages that people want to reuse, problems the AF will address, their ability to solve different types of problems. Often this will be based on, the team that you're debating. You'll have some, we're going to talk about adapting to different teams in a minute. So what offense would you expect the affirmative to be reading in the PMC?
Defunding their military good.
Because?
Because it's no longer, they're gonna be saying that they're mitigating or stopping the slaughter of Palestinians.
Yeah, alright, solves the current bombings in Gaza. Certainly something they would read, I think most of the time probably.
Makes Turkey happy.
Yeah, makes Turkey happy, makes some other countries, quote unquote Arab or quote unquote, global, the Muslim world, right? Like, I don't know, whatever problematic label you'd like to apply to countries that might be pleased by this, it makes some of them happy.
Actually, one of the advantages somebody ran on basically the same one that we had before was that it would increase relations with Iran.
Yeah, sure. Iran too, Egypt, Jordan, bunch of different countries that would probably be pretty happy about it.
Hajj.
Yeah, sure, definitely. Soft power is probably another one.
UN relations.
UN relations, yeah. What's the impact of that? But no, yeah, sure. So then I think you start thinking about how I deal with this offense. So as I sarcastically, like the ass I am, replied, what's the after that? If I were me and I were thinking, well, maybe they make some argument about us keeping the UN happy, I would be saying to myself, well, I don't give a shit if they do. That argument's gonna be bad, and I'm just going to beat it with case answers. Stuff about different relations. So be thinking about what counterpoints do I have to solve stuff. How likely are they to solve the arguments? How good is their impact? What counterpoints do I get? I don't know, not a lot. Maybe if I want to solve for something soft power specific, I can just do something nice in some other country. Might be able to solve back for that. If I want to kind of solve the, Israel conflict, maybe I just have the U.S. start doing peace talks, but I don't really like that counterpoint because I don't think it's likely to solve. So maybe I just have to really answer the case substantively. I think, a bunch of the best counterclaims in this debate are something that's probably textually uncompetitive, like consult some country or condition the pulling of aid on something, or pull only part of aid.
Have Israel accept Hamas's 10-year peace plan?
Yeah, I mean, that's object fiat. Object fiat is when you fiat the object of the resolution, and I think the object of the resolution in this case is Israel. It's probably, like, for a bunch of reasons it's unfair. If you're just like, well, then Israel will just not be jerks, because obviously you're going to win the debate, because that's going to solve much better than the affirmative. But definitely a good thread of thought, even if it's probably not a counterclaim you can actually read. So then you start thinking through, all right, what counterclaims do I need to include? To what extent do I want to answer case? Etc. Then, I don't know, start thinking about the combination of arguments that give you diverse options and handle the affirmative. And really, it's just a question of what you feel comfortable with within the list of offensive arguments we generated. There's a million different strategies that you could read potentially on this. Just a question of making sure that you have some that you feel comfortable with. They're going to be hard to answer, provide you some different offense. And it's really hard to say, absent kind of context and what you're best at and everything, and how good those arguments are going to end up being, each of them individually, exactly what the ideal strategy is. You could certainly read a plain-inclusive counterplan and a biopower argument, or you could read Israel relations, politics, and then have like Egypt broker the talks, or you could read just a bunch of case turns and a bunch of case defense and some like militarism or militarism critique or something, right? Many different possible strategies. So another big thing to talk about is how strategy changes in situations. And I think this is probably, once you get kind of beyond the level of, which I'm sure some of you are already at, kind of beyond, what's a basic strategy that functions? This is kind of where, the magic happens, to use a cheesy phrase, in picking your strategies. So you should be playing, one of the, I think the biggest things, and it's first, it's perhaps first because it's what I thought of first, but I think it's also perhaps first for a reason. You should be playing to your, and more importantly, your partner's strengths. I think a lot of times people, especially, and we'll talk about debating kind of against teams that are a little more experienced than you in a minute, but I think a lot of people are going to often, feel compelled in those instances, or just generally, let me just do something weird. And I think that it's generally just not a good idea to do something that you're not good at, that you're not practiced at. The way for you to not only win the most debates, but also for you to improve the most is to kind of do things that develop your strengths, do things you're familiar with. Now, the caveat to that is, you should not, and I think, I don't know exactly how old all of you are, but I think all of you are going to have quite a bit of time left in this activity. You should not narrowly define your strengths earlier in your career and never deviate from them, right? It would be a very big mistake for you to be, even as like an incoming junior or something, to be like, I'm a critique debater, and that's what I'm good at, so I'm only going to read critiques. The way that Partly works these days, pretty much anyone who's at the highest, kind of at the highest level of the activity, I can probably think of some exceptions. I don't think Brandon read a lot of policy arguments. Brandon was an excellent debater. Brandon Rivera, who's of course teaching here, but for the most part, everyone's kind of very capable at everything. So play around, particularly in your practices, and play around in tournaments. But generally, when you're trying to pick the optimal strategy, it's usually one that's your strength. And you should also really keep your partner in mind, because you know what? Like, let's be real. I think LOs. I was one of you. Perhaps you're not all always LOs. I was an LO really for most of my career. There is a bit of angst that goes along with being the LO, a bit of an inferiority complex for some of us, perhaps, in that you're not usually giving the round-winning speech. That's usually the MO. But I think you should embrace that, and you should do a really good job of setting up your MO. And certainly it is not the case that you're not useful, that your speech is not important. But it's all about, your speech is all about putting it on a platter for your partner. So don't make arguments that they can't extend, right? Like, if you just are like, I have been sitting down with Discipline and Punish for like the last 3 weeks, and I just have got Foucault down, and your partner's like, who's that? You can't just be like, I'm going to read this shell, and you are going to have to go for it. That's not going to work very well. More importantly than that, though, is this. Don't set up MGs that they can't handle. So a really good example of that would be if someone is reading like very, very far left critical affirmative. If you're going to read T, that team is often going to critique topicality. So if someone's saying like give back the land on the AF, if you go in there and you're like, here are some answers to give back the land, here's our critique plus here's topicality, that team is often going to say you should lose for reading topicality. If your MO is not comfortable with that debate, you can't do that, right? Like you can't set them up for that debate. And probably, if you really think, and it's only a few teams in the country who would probably read a critique of topicality, but they're there, but if you think you're going against one of those teams, you actually probably have to start that debate and say the topicality is justified in your LOC. Another example is, don't be conditional unless your partner can answer the conditionality bad procedural. Especially don't be conditional against a team that's very likely to read the procedural if they don't know the answers to it. So don't set up MGs that your partner's not going to be able to handle. So let's talk about adapting the judges, because that's a big determiner of strategy. I do think, and this is not to say speed's the most important thing in debate, because it is very much not. The quality of argument, strategy, everything is much, there's many things that are much more important than speed, but speed is one of the most important things in talking about adapting to judges, because it just limits what you can do. Like, you can read fewer arguments, you can develop your arguments less if your judge isn't able to handle speed. But you need to adapt to that, right? Like, you need to ask yourself, what can this judge reasonably flow? And if you're not sure, I think you always err on the side of going a little bit slower, because it's very possible to win with a slow LOC. It's very difficult, almost impossible to win if your judge can't understand the LOC. I also think a judge's stance on condo is an important question. Not really because, I don't know, for one, because condo determines a lot about like whether or not you read a counterplane. There's some counterplanes that I'd only ever read conditionally that have giant disats to them, right?
What do you mean by condo?
Conditional, the idea of whether or not a judge can, whether or not you can kick a counterplan. So if you read a counterplan, if you read a counterplan unconditionally, that means that you are now advocating the counterplan, right? And if the other team proves the plan is better than the counterplan, then you lose the debate. If you read it conditionally, then you are able to kick your counterplan, even if the counterplan is proven to be a bad idea. So you're able to say, okay, plan's better than the counterplan, but the SQO is better than the plan, so I'm going for the status quo. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So there's some arguments, there's some counterplans I'd never read conditionally because they're just way too easy to turn. Sometimes you need to be conditional so that you can read certain critiques and certain counterplans alongside each other. So always ask yourself whether or not the judge is conditional, or whether or not the judge is going to be down with it. Now, most judges are pretty okay with conditionality, but there's just like a number that just aren't and feel very strongly about it. In front of those judges, you just can't be conditional because because MG theory is so good, right? Like we talked about, you only get one shot to answer it, and they have second line monopoly. They're going to be able to go for it for 5 whole minutes in front of someone who just believes them. It's a bad situation for you. If you're in front of Kevin Calderwood, you can't be conditional. If you're in front of, Zach Moss, Barry Soleil, all those friggin' Concordia people that I love dearly but are wrong about conditionality, can't do that. So there's a bunch of other concerns, but you should always be filtering your strategy through what's going to work in front of a judge, and sometimes even what's going to be awesome in front of a judge. Like if you've got, I don't know, I'm not going to just name a bunch of judges and say like things that they really like, but be paying attention to that. The other thing is adapt to your opponents. Don't play to their strengths. People have different strengths and weaknesses. The one-off K, so one-off K, if you're a slower team, don't read a one-off critique. Like if you're slower against a good MG, don't read a one-off critique. They're going to just swarm you. They're going to read a million answers. They're going to read a framework procedural. They're going to read several different perms with a bunch of net benefits. They're going to answer your critique, and they're going to read a bunch of either link or impact terms. Don't do it if you're the slower team. Capitalize on weaknesses. There are some folks that have not learned how to debate the critique. There are some folks who have not learned how to, or whatever. They've learned, but they're not very good at it, and they're much better at, the straight up debate. There are some folks who just have assumed their whole, who have been taught some Northwest debaters probably, who have been around super multiple conditional strategies the whole time, and their coaches are always like, condo's great, so they're just going to lose to the condo procedural because they haven't learned it, right? Think about their weaknesses, think about not going into people's wheelhouses, stuff like that.
Or policy kids new to Parley who've never done straight up debate in their lives.
Yeah.
Those ones are fun.
Those folks, yeah, certainly those folks. So, and all of this, what does all of this adaptation have in common? It requires information, which means you should be paying the hell attention to who you're debating. Have I debated them before? What did they say? What were they good at? What were they bad at? You should be asking your teammates, what is this team good at? What is this team bad at? You should be paying attention to your judges. You should be writing down their feedback. You should be paying attention to general trends from school. It's not always the same school by school, but like teams from William Jewell, usually more policy oriented than critique oriented, or teams from SIU, usually very likely to go for condo bad against you, or whatever the case may be between different schools. There's also the idea, I won't talk about it too much because I want to finish up these, oh no, there's so much shit left. We won't need to get to all of it, I'll be quicker, and I want to take questions too. I won't talk about metagaming and headfakes. So LO strategies against quote-unquote better teams, I think the compulsion or the feeling is often that you should do something weird, which I think is not great advice. Often the best teams are going to be more familiar with the weird stuff than you. They've read it before, they've been around debate longer. I think something new is much better, like a highly specific disadvantage, or 8 minutes of kind of smaller case arguments that are very specific to the round. Get them away from things they've seen. The procedural debate is also awesome. It's always awesome. It's always so strategic to go for the procedural if you have a judge that is down with it and you have a decent procedural. Because you get this huge time skew, right? They're going to answer it for like 1.5 minutes, and you get 12 minutes. But they're also going to answer it first thing in the MG. So if you decide you're going for it after they answer it, you get like 6 minutes of prep to give a 12-minute speech against a 1.5-minute answer. Like, are you kidding me? Like, no matter how much faster they are than you, you're going to make more arguments than them. You're also going to have massive prep. Time, so they don't like know more arguments than you. It's huge in nullifying the structural advantages that more experienced teams have. Sometimes you can't go for procedural against those teams. I think it's often one of the best ways to win. Also, I think there's the idea of dictating narrow alleyways for the debate to go down. Like, cheater counterplans that force people to read theory against you is one of the best things, right? Like, let's say you want to read a delay counterplan, which says, do the counterplan, but do it on Friday, because like there's a vote on a politics bill that's going to happen before that. There's really no reason, in most instances, why it's important to do plan like today as opposed to tomorrow, right? So there's going to be very hard for them to leverage offense. What does that mean? Well, it means they're going to mostly have to go for theory. What else does that mean? Well, that means that I'm going to be able to prep my ass off on theory, right? And I'm going to force them to totally rely on this one argument and then just come in loaded on it, which is going to, again, nullify their ability to spread me out of the round, nullify their ability to know more arguments than me. Especially because some of these cheater counterplans, like delay or whatever, I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole, I want to move on, but a lot of cheater counterplans haven't been read a lot recently, so people forget answers. No one's reading delay anymore. I don't know, maybe don't go around telling everyone I'm telling you all to read delay, because that's not exactly my point. My point is you can force the debate down in narrow alleyways, you can accomplish a lot. So, let's see, what else is there? Oh, man. Alright. I'm going to hurry up really quickly. So, adapting your strategy in round is really important. Don't just go on autopilot. You're going to want to always be not changing your whole strategy, but tweaking it. A few things you can always do. Always explain how the dissent turns case at the bottom of case. Sometimes you'll write that in prep, but sometimes you won't know what case was. Always have some reasons why. I once saw a debate where someone was reading an argument about Russian orphans was one of the AF impacts. And so on the dissent, the LOC, and it was something about prefer impacts that happen to kids, because kids are important or something, right? So on the LOC, for each of the different dissents, the LO was and on the bottom of this dissent, this is worse for kids than the AF because, right? Don't allow them to do something tricky and sneaky to try to impact filter you out of the round. Explain why you're turning case. Also always see if you can improve your links. Make your links more specific. Maybe in prep you wrote down, plan generally pisses off China a little bit, but then you have some more specific information now that you've seen plan. Tailor your links. Also tailor counterplan solvency. Make counterplan solvency arguments about solving for specific links, right? Because when people have link arguments, what they're doing is setting a condition that, if met, solves the AF, right? Their argument is, plan indicates the United States isn't friends with Israel anymore, which is what's necessary to make the UN like us, right? That's not a good link, but whatever. Say that's link. That means what they have said is anything that indicates we're not friends with Israel anymore is able to solve that advantage, right? So, if you make an argument for your counterplan and say, this is why counterplan indicates that we're not friends with Israel anymore, that is sufficient to solve. Make sense? Yeah, hopefully. Be reading advantage counterplans. Just think of ways that are not at all related to the AF to solve different advantages. You know, have some memorized. You should always have some counterplan that you like that solves global warming. You should always have sorry?
The advantage counterplan is when you just read a counterplan that solves the advantage and then they permit and takes out their advantage, right?
Yeah, and if they are to permit without offense to the counterplan, then yeah, then it would just take out the advantage and then you'd get to have a smaller debate. If you think about how fast you would be able to read an advantage counterplan, if they're not going to be able to beat the advantage counterplan, you've taken out half their offense in like 40 seconds. Huge, awesome trade-off for you. Consider increasing your emphasis on case answers. There's a couple different situations you do that. One is like, if I spend 3 minutes on case, am I just going to win? Because sometimes people have, I don't know, sometimes what I see a lot is, I do AF prep for us. Sometimes we have bad AFs at tournaments without top carries in particular, where we're like, I don't really know what this problem is, some shit about bitcoins is the res, like, I don't know what we're going to solve. And the whole time I'm there, I'm thinking like, man, please let us talk about something other than the affirmative. And people will oblige us and like read a capitalism critique. We'll be like, yes, we've got our impact turns to capitalism, right? Or they'll make it about, or they'll kind of not do a sort of shitty job answering case and then read a dissad, and we'll have these big case impacts. If you see a case that's just like, I don't know, like a sick gazelle, be, you know, the lion or lioness, and just take it out and just kill it, right? Like, if an argument is just bad, just take time to kill all of their offense, because they can't come back from that usually. If you're killing all of the PMC offense, you're just going to win. The other question is, do I need to spend like 3 minutes on case to have a shot, right? Is case super good and I have no ability to solve it with a counterplan, and do I need to do that? Always look out for traps. If something seems fishy, it probably is, right? Especially from a very good team. Like if some team that always reads a nuclear war scenario, like, you know, I would say Whitman falls into that camp. If Whitman's team is reading a debate against you and has no nuke war scenario, it might be because they're setting you up for a critique in the MG that says you shouldn't have nuclear war impacts. And it's like the coolest feeling in the world as an LO when you just are like, wait a minute, something's up here. And then you seize on that, you don't go to nuclear war, and their whole strategy kind of falls apart. Always look to add procedurals. We talked about why procedurals are good. Okay, really quickly, in terms of answering case, always do it. It's so tough for MGs to deal with case answers. It takes them way longer than to just read their dumps on different disads. You also need to have a plan on case. You need a strategy to make it effective. Don't just like read the first 8 arguments you think about against an advantage. Say, hey, these are the structural weaknesses of this advantage. This is where I want to go. Also, having like having 24 case arguments and 1 million disads isn't helpful to you, because you're going to not read all of it, right? Think about, okay, this is the off case I want to read. This is the amount of time that's going to leave me. That's how, what can I do in that time that's effective on case? Always defend the status quo when you're on case, because if you only talk about alt causes, like on global warming, if all you say is you're not able to solve China and there are alternate causes to global warming and whatever, you become very vulnerable to try or die, right? Because if you make those arguments, you might be right that the affirmative doesn't solve, but you've conceded that extinction is coming. So defend the status quo and make sure the status quo is an option for you. Also capitalize on internal inconsistencies, right? Ask yourself if the position makes sense within itself. Does the link resolve the uniqueness? Do the uniqueness claims justify the impact? Really quickly for delivering the speech, you need to know how long different arguments take you, which I kind of just talked about. Make the order logical. Read things. If something's going to be cross-applied to other things, read that first. Keep your time, right? All the time I see LOs who are holding timers, who are looking at their timers, who still run out of time in the middle of a fucking disad. Right? Like, if you're running out of time, start cutting arguments, start changing your speech. Yeah. Also, one thing about order is everything else being equal, always read the arguments that you are most familiar with first. That gets you into a nice rhythm, instead of like right off the bat, like asking your partner like what shit says. Build into a rhythm, build into your speed. There's some stuff about how to practice here that I want to talk about. So let's really quickly, I know you all have to go, I'm sorry, I tried to kind of finish quickly. Any questions? I know you all have to run. My bad. No questions? That's weird. y'all are free to run off to the next lecture.